we hear the United States accusing Russia of preparing to use chemical weapons, and you have to ask yourself, how unoriginal must they be to continuously use this WMD lie every time their backs are up against the wall? Because that's what they're claiming. They're claiming Russia's back is up against the wall, and they're so desperate that they'll use chemical weapons. But as I will prove to you, the West themselves will explain why chemical weapons are not a game changer on the battlefield, why they are not as effective as just even ordinary conventional weapons, and why it would absolutely make no sense for Russia to do this. But they need to make up a reason so that they can stage the false flag, so that they can give themselves a window of opportunity to intervene directly in Ukraine, just as they tried and partially did in Syria, and of course the way they justified the invasion of Iraq in 2003, when Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction, and they just lied about that. So you gotta think about this. They did Iraq. They lied about WMDs in Iraq completely, and then literally the next country over on the map, Syria, they lied about WMDs there in pursuit of regime change, and now in Ukraine, things are not going well for the West, so now they're lying about WMDs again. I hope you can spot the pattern. Now, I want to show you an old article I wrote back in 2013, West's WMD lies, Fray as Syrian army overturns terrorist proxies. Absurd chemical weapons claims begin to fall apart amidst NATO's desperate bid to save its collapsing terror front in Syria. And that was what was going on. They were losing their proxy war, and so they needed to create some sort of justification to get the US militarily involved. And then in a way, that is what they ended up doing. And then Russia checkmated them. And then from 2015 onward, you saw how this animosity began building up between the US and Russia, because the US was upset that Russia foiled their attempt to destroy Syria the same way they destroyed Libya and Iraq. And in this article, I jump around quite a bit. I cite this article from The Independent by Robert Fisk, and he is citing people in the Syrian army saying, why should we use chemical weapons when our MiG aircraft and their bombs cause infinitely more destruction? Is that true? Is that true? Yes, that is true. You know how we know that that's true? Because the US military has studied the use of chemical weapons in modern warfare. The last time they were used extensively and openly was the Iran-Iraq War. So let's check out this document put together by the United States Marine Corps, 1990, and let's see what they say about chemical weapons. I'm going to read quite a bit of this. Please bear with me, but this is really important information to keep in mind about the true nature of chemical weapons and why no one is going to use them on the battlefield if they have conventional weapons available to them. So it says, chemical weapons require quite particular weather and geographic conditions for optimum effectiveness. Given the relative non-persistence of all agents employed during this war, including mustard, there was only a brief window of employment opportunity, both daily and seasonally, when the agents could be used. And when they're talking about persistence, they mean once you fire them into an area, the wind immediately starts dispersing them. Even though the Iraqis employed mustard agent in the rainy season and also in the marshes, its effectiveness was significantly reduced under those conditions. As the Iraqis learned to their chagrin, mustard is not a good agent to employ in the mountains unless you own the high ground and your enemy is in the valleys. We are uncertain as the relative effectiveness of nerve agents, since those which were employed are by nature much less persistent than mustard. So they're saying, even though nerve agents are very scary, when you hear them described, their persistence on the battlefield is even less than mustard gas. That's what they're saying right there. In order to gain killing concentrations of these agents, pre-dawn attacks are best conducted in areas where the morning breezes are likely to blow away from friendly positions. Chemical weapons have a low kill ratio. You always hear people talking about chemical weapons like they're the next step just below nuclear weapons. They're not. They're a step below just regular conventional weapons. If you have artillery and just a bunch of dumb bombs, which Russia has in vast abundance. There's no reason for you to ever use chemical weapons. You could level a whole city. You could inspire any type of terror you want amongst a population or amongst enemy troops without ever using chemical weapons. They're almost practically useless. There's only, just like the document said, there's only very, very specific circumstances where it even remotely makes sense to use them. Let's continue. Chemical weapons have a low kill ratio, just as in World War I, during which the ratio of deaths to injured from chemicals was 2 to 3%. That figure appears to be borne out again in this war, although reliable data on casualties are very difficult to obtain. We deem it remarkable that the death rate should hold at such a low level, even with the introduction of nerve agents. If those rates are correct, as they well may be, this further reinforces the position that we must not think of chemical weapons as a poor man's nuclear weapon. While such weapons have great psychological potential, they are not killers or destroyers on a scale with nuclear or biological weapons. And then they talk about World War I, and again, they reiterate that the death rate was only 2%. And so that's chemical weapons. And that's why when you heard the US accusing Syria of using chemical weapons 1 or 2 days from the Syrian army finally and fully taking control over a city, it was utterly absurd. There's absolutely no reason for them to use chemical weapons at any point of the conflict, especially just a day or two away from completely securing a city. It makes absolutely no sense. And so that's how you know that it was being staged, because the only benefit that this chemical weapon attack had was giving the US an opportunity to insert itself into the conflict, and that's it. And so who benefited from that? The opposition. And when you looked at these attacks, it would be like 1 or 2 canisters involved, and you could see this document is explaining how much you need to use to even have any sort of impact on the battlefield. And so keep that in mind. And this is what the Western media depends on. They depend on your ignorance of this, your ignorance of how actual chemical warfare operates and how much less effective than just ordinary conventional weapons it actually is. Now, so knowing that, let's look at how ridiculous this claim is. So this is The Guardian. Clear sign Putin is weighing up use of chemical weapons in Ukraine, says Biden. U.S. president says Russian leader's back is against the wall and warns of severe consequences of any such attack. Now, this is a lie built on top of a lie, and I'm going to explain why Putin's back is not against the wall in just a minute. But that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to pretend that Russia is desperate, and so because they're desperate, they're willing to take the risk of using chemical weapons. But as you just saw, according to the US military's own analysis, chemical weapons are not what you defer to when your back is up against the wall. It's probably one of the last things. It's very complicated. It's an extra complication in a battle that you're already losing, which is why your back would be up against the wall. But as I'm going to show you, Russia is not losing in Ukraine. I'm going to explain to you why everything is moving so slowly. When I explain it to you, I think you're going to get it. But I want to show you this from Harvard University, the Harvard Gazette right here. Russia's remaining weapons are horrific and confounding. This is National and World Affairs, the Harvard Gazette. And they're saying the Kennedy School's Bunn assesses threat, possible fallout of chemical attack in Ukraine, including the excruciating choices Biden and NATO would face. And so they're asking Matthew Bunn about Biden officials have warned that Russia may deploy chemical or biological weapons in Ukraine. Why? And what kind of things might they do? From a purely military perspective, there are no military targets that nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons could destroy that Russia can't destroy with its air power and rockets. So right there, they're just admitting right there. This is common sense. Anyone being honest has to admit this. There's literally no reason for them to use this. But look at how he tries to keep this ball in play. The main purpose of using them would probably be to shock the Ukrainians into surrender, which is completely stupid, because if they want to shock Ukrainians into surrender, they could just flatten Ukrainian cities with conventional weapons. They don't need to resort to chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. They just said it. They just said it. Unfortunately, a lot of Russia's capabilities are secret. So yeah, it's a secret, and everything else is speculation, which brings us back up to the top here. Russia's remaining weapons are horrific and confounding. You don't actually know that because they're all secret and possibly non-existent. And that's what the whole article is about. So again, this is more WMD lies, 2022 edition, the new edition, third edition. You had Iraq, you had Syria, now you've got Ukraine. It's just the same nonsense over and over again. And even when they're trying to explain why Russia would use it, it makes absolutely no sense. They're explaining to you why Russia would never use them. Makes absolutely no sense. So that's chemical weapons. I showed you how the US themselves admit they're used on the battlefield, how useless they actually are if you have plenty of conventional weapons. Russia has plenty of conventional weapons. And let me start with that. Let me start with the Pentagon itself admitting how much military power Russia still has at its disposal a month into this conflict. And then we can go on from there as to why Russia is taking its time in Ukraine. So let's check out this transcript from the US Department of Defense. This was March 21st, 2022. So this was earlier this week. Senior defense official holds a background briefing. Okay, and let's go down here. So there was a journalist asking about Russian combat power, and you have to understand, these journalists are buying their own lies. They honestly think Russia is being crushed in Ukraine, and that's simply not. That's not a fact. That's not anywhere near truth. And even the Pentagon has to temper these expectations after a month of fighting. This is not going to end well for people pretending that Ukraine. I mean, people telling you that Ukraine is going to win, people are going to remember that you were the one who told them that. And they're never going to trust you again when they see what happens to Ukraine here shortly. So let's see what the Pentagon, how they start backing away from this myth that Ukraine is crushing Russia. So he says, that gets back to your point about combat power. I would say that today we assess Russian combat power at just below 90%. And to put this in better context, they're talking about Russian combat power allotted for this operation in Ukraine, not Russia's overall military power. So it's at 90% after a month of intensive fighting. And again, you have to remember, yes, they're expending an awful lot, but they also built up an awful lot since the early fall, and they just have a lot available to them. We would assess today a little less than 90%. Again, what the defense official said last week, roughly 75% of their battalion tactical group generation capacity, they have committed into Ukraine. We believe that they have committed more than 60% of their fixed wing and rotary wing capability. So they have put a lot into this fight, and they still have a lot left. We have to recognize that they are taking casualties every day. And so now they're talking about all of these, I've heard it described as a tactical vignette, where you watch some video posted by Ukraine's government of them blowing up a Russian tank. And they do this a lot. And then you start to get the impression, because you're not seeing anything from Russia's side, because the Western media has completely censored them from Western information space, you get the impression that Ukraine is enjoying this overwhelming advantage over Russia, and they're just completely crushing Russia's military out in the field. It's simply not so. And so this is what he's trying to get at without directly saying it. They're losing aircraft, they're losing armor and vehicles, no doubt about that. Tanks, APCs, artillery units, helicopters, fixed-wing jets. They're losing, I wouldn't say they're losing everything every day in those categories. So what he's admitting is that even though Ukraine acts as if they're just shooting everything out of the sky that Russia puts up and blasting every tank into smithereens that, crosses the line and kills every soldier that comes into range, that's not true. The Pentagon is telling you that is not true. We see them continue to suffer casualties and losses, but they built up an awful lot of combat power, as we said back in the fall, that Mr. Putin had arranged an oppressive alignment of combined arms capability that he still has the vast majority available to him. So the vast majority of what was prepared to go into Ukraine is still available to Russia. Their back is in no way up against any wall. And let's go to this map. And I'm just going to remind you that these live maps are created by pro-Western, pro-NATO, pro-Ukrainian, whoever's behind it. They're obviously very biased in favor of the US, NATO, and Ukraine. So keep that in mind. But even still, you can see all of this territory Russia has taken. And as they've taken territory over the last month, they have not lost any of it, any significant Ukrainian counterattack. You can see right here, what is that? That's a salient forming. And they're in the process of encircling Ukrainian troops all along this line of contact. There's an extensive amount of Ukrainian military forces that if they try to pull up and leave, they will be destroyed. If they stay where they are, they're going to be encircled, cut off, and either allowed to surrender or decimated. And then if you zoom out, you will see that they're doing the exact same thing on a much larger scale. They're pushing south from around Kiev, and they're pushing up north from Crimea. And eventually they'll meet in the middle somewhere here, and everything operating inside of here is going to be completely cut off. So no amount of weapons dumped into Ukraine is going to make a difference as these encirclements continue to develop. As they develop, it's going to be harder and harder to resupply these troops, rearm these troops, send more troops in to reinforce them, to replace the forces that are being decimated. And we're watching Russia do in Ukraine exactly what it successfully did in Syria, which was a very time-consuming, systematic, methodical process of encircling cities, and not all at the same time. They would have their forces out there working on every single city, but they would pick one city to work on. They would encircle it. They would open up corridors to get civilians out, and then they would give the fighters inside a choice to either surrender or be decimated. And then they would execute that part of the mission. Once the city was secured, they would take those forces, battle-hardened, experienced forces, they would move them to the next city. At each city that they worked on, they would become more and more successful and efficient at doing this. And that is exactly what's going to happen in Ukraine. So whose back is up against the wall? It is not Russia, it's Ukraine and the people in the US and NATO who put them up to this self-destructive conflict. And if there is a chemical weapon attack, it is most certainly going to be Ukraine or the US and NATO, or all of them working together to carry it out. There's literally no reason for Russia to do it. There's nothing for Russia to gain by using chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. And that's the Western media themselves admitting that. So one takeaway from this video that I hope everyone gets is this Harvard Gazette piece where these experts are admitting that there's nothing to gain by using these type of weapons. They could easily accomplish all of these objectives using conventional weapons, which Russia has in abundance. And I also want people to please show people this US Marine Corps document analyzing the use of chemical weapons in the Iran-Iraq war and how useless they are in comparison to conventional weapons, which again, Russia has in abundance. According to the Pentagon itself, they are nowhere near exhausting just the resources they allotted for this operation, saying nothing of their overall military power. And one last point I just want to reiterate again and again is when you hear people saying Russia is losing in Ukraine, they're not achieving any of their objectives, just remember what they're trying to do in Ukraine has not been tried by any other country in recent times. When the US invades another country, it's always a much smaller country, a country they have used sanctions against for years and years to degrade their military power, their economic power before going in. They're usually countries with half or less than half of the population of Ukraine when Russia went in, and just physically smaller countries. So just check this out. This is Iraq right here, and then it's compared to Ukraine. And they're saying Ukraine is 38% larger than Iraq. Ukraine, when Russia went in, had 44 million people. In 2003, Iraq had about 25 million people. When the US went into Iraq in 2003, they had almost 500,000 troops together with the British. When Russia went into Ukraine, they had less than 200,000 troops. When the Western media is claiming that, oh, Russia thought they were going to take Ukraine in 2 or 3 days, and now they don't know what to do. That is ridiculous. The Pentagon itself admits how much weapons, men, and machines they have prepared along the border of Ukraine for this military operation, to the point where they have been fighting intensely for 1 month, and they're only down to 90% of their combat power. They prepared for a protracted military campaign. So what we're hearing from the Western media is just lies. And just as they're lying about that, they're lying about Russia considering the use of chemical weapons. And again, this is the same thing the US has done over and over and over again. Iraq, Syria, now we're up to Ukraine. This is not the first time the US is telling the truth, and the first time Russia is going to be lying about it. Because remember, back in 2003, Russia said, there is no evidence that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. We want to see the evidence, and the US never produced any, because there wasn't any, because the US was lying. And they're lying today as well. So just keep all of that in mind. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share it. Think about subscribing. It's free to do, and it helps the channel grow. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please check the video description below for other places you can find my work in case I get deleted off of YouTube, like I've been deleted off of Twitter, and specifically for talking about Ukraine. Also in the video description below are going to be all of the links that I've discussed in this video, including this document by the US Marine Corps and this by Harvard. Show people this when talking about this threat of a chemical weapon attack, so that it is abundantly clear that Russia has nothing to gain from this, and the only people who have anything to gain by this are the ones we know consistently lie about WMDs. And also in the video description below are ways you can help support my work. And to everyone who has been, whether it's through Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon month to month, or through Buy Me a Coffee, you could also do one-time donations. I also still have PayPal, and there's a couple of other options there if you want. To everyone who has been helping out, thank you so much. And even if you're helping out by just sending news tips or helping share my work or sending kind words, that is also greatly appreciated. Thank you so much. And as always, thank you for watching.